The wolf's yellow eyes gleamed like frozen starlight as Marcus crouched behind a snow-laden pine, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. Below in the clearing, a massive Douglas fir had fallen across what looked like a child's legs, trapping her against the rocky ground. The pack moved with calculated patience, predators who knew their prey couldn't escape. Marcus's grandfather would have called this moment a test from the spirits. "Trust your training," the old man's voice whispered from memory. "Fear makes prey. Confidence makes pack leader." The girl, she couldn't be more than 8 or 9, wore gear that made Marcus's jaw tighten. North Face jacket, probably $600, high-end hiking boots that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. What was a kid dressed like that, doing alone in backcountry that challenged experienced mountaineers? Focus, he told himself. Questions later. Action now. Marcus shed his pack and pulled out the rope his grandfather had taught him to braid from hemp and sinew. The commercial gear the search and rescue team issued was fine for weekend warriors, but up here, where temperatures could drop 40 degrees without warning, traditional Cherokee methods had kept his family alive for generations. The lead wolf, a massive grey female with scars across her muzzle, tilted her head as if sensing his presence. Marcus froze. In the silence between heartbeats, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The little girl was humming, not crying, not screaming, humming a soft, melodic tune that seemed to drift on the wind like smoke. And the wolves were listening. Their aggressive posture had shifted, ears forward instead of flattened, tails neutral instead of raised. The pack leader took a step back from the trapped child, her yellow gaze fixed on something Marcus couldn't see. Impossible, he thought. But his grandfather's stories crept up from the dark corners of memory, tales of people who could speak the old language, the one that all living things understood before humans forgot how to listen. Marcus had always dismissed those stories as folklore. Now, watching 7 starving wolves respond to a child's song, he wondered if his grandfather had been preparing him for more than wilderness survival. The girl's humming faltered, and instantly the pack's demeanor changed. The lead female snarled, lips pulling back to reveal teeth like ivory daggers. The other wolves pressed closer, forming a tighter circle. No more time for questions. Marcus cupped his hands around his mouth and released the hunting call his grandfather had taught him, a sound that carried the authority of mountains and the warning of storms. The wolves' heads snapped toward him in unison. "That's right," he whispered, standing slowly. "New player in the game." He descended through the snow-heavy trees with movements that seemed to flow rather than step. Each placement of his feet, each shift of his weight, followed patterns his grandfather had drilled into him until they became instinct. Move like water, think like stone. The pack watched his approach with the wariness predators reserved for other predators. Marcus kept his eyes on the lead female. In Cherokee tradition, the matriarch commanded respect, whether human or animal. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of jerky, holding it at shoulder height. "Your people are hungry," he said quietly, his words carrying across the clearing. "But this one is under my protection." The lead wolf's ears flicked forward. Marcus tossed the jerky to his left, away from the trapped girl. The smallest wolf, probably a yearling, broke formation to investigate. "Emma?" Marcus called to the girl without taking his eyes off the pack. "That's your name, right?" The child's voice was steadier than it should have been. "How did you know?" Lucky guess. He wasn't about to admit that her expensive gear screamed trust fund, and Emma was the name on the missing person report. "Are you hurt?" "My leg's stuck, but I don't think it's broken. They've been watching me for a long time. Not trying to eat me or scaring me to death, just watching." Marcus tossed another piece of jerky, this time to his right. 2 more wolves followed it, their attention divided between food and the standoff. "Emma, I need you to do exactly what I say. Can you do that?" "Yes. When I give the word, I want you to hum that song again. The one you were singing before." A pause. "You heard that?" The whole mountain heard it. Marcus pulled his grandfather's knife from its sheath, not to threaten, but to show the blade's bone handle carved with symbols that predated European contact. The lead wolf's gaze fixed on it with what looked almost like recognition. "They're not bad," Emma said suddenly. "The wolves, they're just sad." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 15 years ago, the night his parents disappeared, 5-year-old Marcus had told the police the same thing about the coyotes found near their abandoned campsite. The investigating officers had written it off as childhood trauma and imagination. But what if it hadn't been imagination at all? "On 3, Marcus said, stepping closer to the fallen tree. 1, 2, the lead wolf tensed, muscles coiling beneath grey fur. 3. Emma's humming rose through the mountain air like a prayer, and the impossible happened again. The lead wolf's ears swiveled forward, her scarred muzzle tilting as if receiving instructions in a language older than words. The pack shifted, not retreating, but listening, waiting. Marcus seized the moment, diving toward the fallen Douglas fir. He wedged his shoulder against the massive trunk and heaved, muscles straining against wood that probably weighed 800 pounds. The tree didn't budge. "Can you pull your leg out?" he grunted. "I think so." Emma wriggled backward, her small frame slipping free just as Marcus's strength gave out. The trunk crashed back into position with a sound like thunder. The wolves scattered at the noise, melting into the forest with supernatural silence. Only the matriarch lingered, fixing Marcus with a stare that seemed to carry centuries of mountain wisdom. Then she too vanished, leaving nothing but paw prints in the snow and the ghost of Emma's melody hanging in the air. Marcus helped the girl to her feet, checking for injuries with hands that still trembled from adrenaline. No broken bones, just bruises and the kind of deep cold that killed people in these mountains. He wrapped her in his spare jacket and radioed base camp. "This is Clearwater. Found the missing hiker. Requesting immediate extraction." Jake Morrison's voice crackled through static. "Copy that, Marcus. ETA 20 minutes. Nice work, kid." Marcus was 17 and had been guiding search and rescue operations for 2 years, but to Jake, to everyone, he'd always be Joseph Clearwater's grandson, the traumatized boy who'd lost his parents and barely spoke above a whisper. The helicopter ride down felt like descending from one world into another. Emma pressed against the window, watching the wilderness shrink beneath them, and Marcus caught something in her expression that matched the hollow ache in his own chest. She didn't want to go back either. 3 days later, Marcus stood in the equipment shed behind Morrison Search and Rescue headquarters, inventorying rope and checking radio batteries for the 4th time that morning. Busy work. Jake had assigned him to gear maintenance instead of active missions since the wolf incident, claiming he needed time to process what had happened up there. What Marcus needed was to be back in the mountains, not trapped in this cinder-block building that smelled like diesel fuel and disappointment. "You're overthinking those batteries," said Sarah Chen, leaning against the doorframe. At 19, she was only 2 years older than Marcus, but carried herself like someone who'd never questioned her place in the world. "They're either dead or they're not." Marcus set down the radio without looking up. "Jake wants a full systems check. Jake wants you to stay busy so you won't ask uncomfortable questions about little girls who sing to wolves." Sarah stepped inside, lowering her voice. "Half the team thinks you're making it up. The other half thinks you've inherited your grandfather's gifts." The word hung in the air like smoke. Joseph Clearwater had been respected as a tracker and wilderness guide, but the older residents of Crestone remembered the stories, how he could find lost hikers by following bird calls, how animals behaved differently around him, how he'd known about the avalanche on Challenger Point 3 days before it happened. Marcus had spent most of his life trying to be normal, to fit into the world that had taken his parents and left him with nothing but Cherokee folk tales and a crippling fear of crowds. The last thing he needed was people thinking he'd inherited his grandfather's supposed mystical abilities. "There's nothing mystical about tracking," he said, the words automatic. "Just observation and training." Sarah studied him with dark eyes that missed nothing. "So you're saying Emma Hartwell is a perfectly normal 8-year-old who just happens to hum lullabies to hungry wolf packs?" Before Marcus could answer, Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway. At 53, the former Army Ranger still moved like he expected enemy fire from behind every tree. "Clearwater. My office. Now." The walk across the compound felt like a death march. Jake's office was a monument to 2 decades of mountain rescue operations, commendations, newspaper clippings, and photographs of successful missions covering every wall. Marcus had dreamed of adding his own achievements to this collection, of proving he belonged somewhere. Jake gestured to a chair but remained standing himself, arms crossed. "The Hartwell family wants to thank you personally. They're hosting a reception tomorrow night at their estate in Aspen." Marcus felt his throat constrict. The idea of facing a crowd of wealthy strangers making small talk about his heroic rescue made his skin crawl. "I don't think—" It wasn't a request. Jake's voice carried the weight of final authority. "This organization depends on donations from families like the Hartwells. You'll attend, you'll be gracious, and you'll represent us well." Through the window, Marcus could see the Sangre de Cristo peaks rising against the afternoon sky. Up there, everything made sense. Animals followed predictable patterns. Weather obeyed natural laws. People were just another variable to account for, not an overwhelming mass of expectations and social protocols he'd never learned to navigate. Down here, he was drowning slowly in a world that demanded performances he couldn't give. "I said it wasn't a request." Jake's tone could have frozen the Colorado River in July. "You saved their daughter's life. The least you can do is let them say thank you." Marcus stared at his hands, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came before panic attacks. The idea of walking into a mansion full of Aspen's elite, wearing his one good shirt and pretending to be comfortable with small talk about trust funds and ski seasons, made his grandfather's survival training seem simple by comparison. "What if I mess it up?" The words escaped before he could stop them, carrying more vulnerability than he'd shown anyone since his parents' funeral. For a moment, Jake's expression softened. "You won't. Just be yourself, answer their questions, and don't mention the wolves unless they ask directly." The dismissal felt like ice water down Marcus's spine. Don't mention the wolves. The most important part of the entire rescue, the fact that Emma had somehow communicated with a starving pack, was apparently an embarrassing detail to be swept under the rug. Marcus was halfway to the door when Jake's phone rang. He recognized the ringtone immediately, the emergency line reserved for active search and rescue operations. "Morrison." Jake's voice shifted into command mode. "What's the situation?" Marcus paused with his hand on the doorknob, emergency protocol overriding his desire to escape. Every member of the team was trained to gather intel during crisis calls, even when officially off duty. "Missing hiker, Blanca Peak area," Jake continued, his face growing grim. 12-year-old boy, separated from his family group approximately 1,800 hours yesterday. Weather service is calling for a major system moving in, could dump 3 feet by tomorrow night. Marcus turned back toward the desk. Blanca Peak was serious backcountry, technical terrain that challenged experienced mountaineers. A 12-year-old lost up there with a blizzard coming had maybe 12 hours before hypothermia became the primary threat. "Who's available for immediate deployment?" Jake asked the caller, then winced at the response. "Understood. We'll mobilize what we have." He hung up and immediately began pulling maps from his filing cabinet. "Sarah's in Denver visiting family. Rodriguez is still recovering from that shoulder injury on Humboldt. Mitchell's got food poisoning." Jake spread a topographical map across his desk, marking the last known position with a red 10th that leaves me and whoever I can borrow from Park County. Marcus stepped closer to the map, his social anxiety temporarily forgotten. The red X sat in a maze of couloirs and false summits that could hide a dozen search parties. Worse, the projected storm track would make helicopter extraction impossible for at least 48 hours. "I know that area," Marcus said quietly. My grandfather took me up there when I was 14. There are caves on the north face, old mining shafts where someone might take shelter. Jake looked up from the map, something calculating in his expression. You've never led a solo rescue operation. No, sir. Marcus's pulse quickened. Every fiber of his being wanted to be on that mountain, following tracks and reading the stories written in broken vegetation and disturbed stone. But I've assisted on 14 missions in similar terrain. Assisted. That's different from calling the shots when everything goes wrong. Jake traced the contour lines with his finger, his military mind weighing variables Marcus could only guess at. This isn't a training exercise. A kid's life is on the line. Weather's deteriorating, and backup is hours away. Through the window, Marcus could see storm clouds building over the peaks like grey fortresses. His grandfather had taught him to read weather patterns in the color of distant snow, the behavior of birds, the way aspens turn their leaves before major systems. This storm would be a killer, the kind that dropped temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and buried landmarks under avalanche-prone snow. "I can find him," Marcus said, the words carrying a certainty that surprised them both. Jake studied him for a long moment. "Your grandfather used to get that same look when he was tracking, like he could see things the rest of us missed." "It's not mystical," Marcus replied automatically. Just observation and training." "Yeah, I've heard that before." Jake folded the map and handed it to Marcus. "The family's name is Peterson. Tommy Peterson, 12 years old, experienced hiker but unfamiliar with this specific area. Last seen wearing a blue jacket and grey hiking boots." Marcus accepted the map with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. This was what he'd trained for, what every hour in the wilderness with his grandfather had been preparing him for. "There's one condition," Jake added. "After you bring that boy home safe, you go to the Hartwell reception. No arguments, no excuses. Deal?" Marcus nodded, already mentally cataloguing the gear he'd need for a solo winter rescue. The Aspen social nightmare seemed like a problem for some future version of himself. Right now, a 12-year-old was alone in the mountains with a blizzard bearing down. "Get moving," Jake said. "Clock's ticking, and that storm won't wait for anyone." Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, the folded map heavy in his hands like a piece of lead. The anticipation that had flooded his system moments before was already curdling into something darker, more familiar. His grandfather's voice echoed from memory. "Confidence is just fear that's learned to walk forward." But what if the fear was right this time? "You getting cold feet, Clearwater?" Jake's voice carried a note of challenge that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "Because I can call Park County, wait for their team to mobilize. Course, that's another 3 hours minimum, and Tommy Peterson doesn't have 3 hours to spare." The guilt hit like a physical blow. A 12-year-old boy was somewhere on Blanca Peak, probably hypothermic already, definitely terrified. Every minute Marcus spent second-guessing himself was a minute closer to a body recovery instead of a rescue. "No, sir. Just running through the checklist." Marcus forced his voice to remain steady, but his palms were slick with sweat despite the October chill. He'd assisted on 14 missions, sure, but always with backup. Always with Sarah or Rodriguez or one of the other senior team members ready to take over if he froze up. Solo rescue was different. Solo rescue meant every decision was his. Every mistake could be fatal, not just for him, but for Tommy Peterson. Jake must have seen something in his expression because his tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. "You know what your grandfather told me the first time I sent him out alone? This was maybe 20 years ago. Kid named Billy Vasquez, lost in a slot canyon down near Great Sand Dunes." Marcus shook his head, afraid to trust his voice. He said, "Jake, I've been tracking deer since I could walk and reading weather since I could see, but I've never been responsible for bringing someone else's child home." You know what I told him? "What?" I said, "Joseph, the mountains don't care about your experience level. They care about your instincts, and your instincts are the best I've ever seen." Jake leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with eyes that had evaluated hundreds of rescue personnel over the years. You've got the same instincts. The question is whether you trust them. Trust them. Marcus thought about Emma Hartwell humming to a pack of starving wolves, about the way the lead female had responded to his grandfather's bone-handled knife, about the stories he'd been told to keep quiet. Were those instincts, or just wishful thinking wrapped around childhood trauma? Outside, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, fat, heavy flakes that meant serious accumulation. The kind of snow that erased tracks and buried landmarks, that turned familiar terrain into a white maze where one wrong turn could mean wandering until hypothermia shut down your brain. What if I can't find him? The words came out barely above a whisper. What if I get up there and I'm just lost? What if everything my grandfather taught me isn't enough when it really matters? Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the wind pick up outside. You want to know what your real fear is, Marcus? It's not that you'll fail, it's that you'll succeed, and then people will expect you to keep succeeding. They'll expect you to be your grandfather. The observation hit so close to home that Marcus felt his breath catch. Since Joseph Clearwater's death 3 years ago, everyone in Crestone had been watching Marcus, waiting for him to step into those impossible shoes. The old-timers still talked about his grandfather's legendary rescues, his uncanny ability to find people when everyone else had given up hope. How do you follow a legend? How do you carry expectations that heavy without being crushed? Maybe I'm not ready, Marcus said, the admission tasting like failure. Maybe I should have stayed in the mountains with him longer, learned more before he died? Jake's voice was gentle but firm. Kid, nobody's ever ready for their first solo. Not really. You think I was ready when the army dropped me in Afghanistan with a squad of 19-year-olds who thought war was going to be like a video game? Marcus looked up, surprised by the personal revelation. Jake rarely talked about his military service. I was terrified, Jake continued, convinced I was going to get everyone killed, but you know what I learned? Fear's not the enemy. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you from making stupid mistakes. It's when you stop being afraid that you become dangerous, to yourself and everyone counting on you. The map seemed to pulse in Marcus's hands, the red X marking Tommy Peterson's last known location like a heartbeat against his palm. Somewhere up there, a kid was waiting for help that might not come, and Marcus was the only one close enough to matter. But the weight of it, the responsibility, the expectations, the crushing possibility of failure, felt heavier than any pack he'd ever carried into the backcountry. Time's up, Jake said quietly. What's it going to be? Marcus stared at the map one final time, watching snowflakes melt against the window behind Jake's desk. The red X marking Tommy Peterson's location seemed to burn through the paper, and he could almost hear his grandfather's voice cutting through the years. The mountains will teach you everything you need to know, but only if you're brave enough to listen. I'll take it, Marcus said, the words emerging with a steadiness that surprised him. I'll bring him home. Jake nodded once, sharp and decisive. Gear up. You've got maybe 6 hours before that storm turns the whole peak into a death trap. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood beside his battered Ford pickup, methodically checking equipment that could mean the difference between life and death. Emergency bivvy sack, medical kit, extra food and water. His grandfather's bone-handled survival knife wrapped in its worn leather sheath. Each item went into his pack with deliberate precision, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought threatened to stumble. Sarah appeared beside the truck as he secured his snowshoes. Heard you drew the short straw for Blanca Peak. Not exactly a straw draw. Marcus tested the weight of his pack, adjusting the straps until the load rode perfectly balanced. More like volunteer duty. Same thing, when you're the only one stupid enough to volunteer. But Sarah's expression was serious, almost worried. That's serious terrain up there, Marcus. Technical climbing, weather exposure, terrain that'll kill you if you make one mistake. Marcus shouldered the pack, feeling its familiar weight settle against his spine like an old friend. I know. Do you? She stepped closer, lowering her voice. Because this isn't like Emma Hartwell. This isn't stumbling across someone during a routine patrol. This is going into the backcountry alone, in deteriorating conditions, with nobody coming to save your ass if things go sideways. For a moment, the old doubt crept back in. The whisper that said he was 17 years old, pretending to be something he wasn't. A kid playing dress-up in his grandfather's shadow. But then he thought about Tommy Peterson, 12 years old and alone somewhere in that white maze above treeline. "A kid's going to die if I don't try," Marcus said simply. "Everything else is just noise." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then stepped back. "Your grandfather would be proud." Marcus climbed into the truck without responding, but her words followed him as he drove north toward the mountains. Would Joseph Clearwater be proud? Or would he see this for what it was, a terrified teenager about to get in over his head? The drive to the Blanca Peak trailhead took 45 minutes through increasingly heavy snow. By the time Marcus parked at the empty trail register, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 yards, and the temperature was plummeting fast. He signed in with numb fingers, noting that the Peterson family had registered the previous morning for a day hike, which meant they'd planned to be back before dark yesterday. Something had gone very wrong. Marcus strapped on his snowshoes and checked his GPS one final time before stepping onto the trail. The familiar ritual of wilderness travel settled over him like armor. Watch the ground for tracks. Scan the trees for trail markers. Feel the wind for weather changes. Within minutes, the parking area disappeared behind a curtain of falling snow, and he was alone with the mountain. The first mile climbed steadily through dense forest, the trail well marked despite the accumulating snow. Marcus found the Peterson family's tracks easily. 4 sets of boot prints from yesterday, already partially filled but still readable to eyes trained in tracking. He could distinguish Tommy's smaller prints from his parents and older sisters, could see where the boy had occasionally wandered off the main trail to investigate fallen logs or interesting rock formations. A normal family outing, until something had gone catastrophically wrong. At the 2-mile mark, Marcus found where the family had stopped for lunch, a small clearing with a fire ring and fallen log that served as a bench. The snow here was more disturbed, scuffed with footprints and the circular patterns that meant people had been moving around for an extended period. He could see where Tommy had built a small snowman beside the fire ring, where his parents had spread out a tarp for their packs. And he could see where the tracks diverged. 3 sets of prints headed back down the trail toward the parking area. 1 set, Tommy's, continued up the mountain alone. Marcus crouched beside the boy's tracks, reading the story written in compressed snow and disturbed earth. The prints were deeper here, more erratic, suggesting Tommy had been running or at least moving quickly. Excited about something, maybe, or chasing after a glimpse of wildlife that had caught his attention. Either way, he was alone on a mountain that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Marcus stood, adjusted his pack, and followed the solitary trail deeper into the wilderness. Behind him, his own tracks disappeared into the swirling snow, erasing any evidence of his passage. There would be no going back now, only forward, into the storm and the unknown, carrying the weight of a stranger's life and his grandfather's legacy. The mountain waited, patient and deadly as winter itself. Marcus followed Tommy's tracks for another half-mile before the trail disappeared entirely, swallowed by wind-sculpted snow that obliterated any trace of human passage. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since the trailhead, and the storm was intensifying with each passing minute. Through the whipping snow, he caught glimpses of the terrain ahead, a maze of rocky outcroppings and false ridges that could hide a dozen lost hikers. His grandfather had taught him that mountains revealed their secrets reluctantly, offering clues only to those patient enough to read the subtle language of disturbed vegetation and weathered stone. But as Marcus crouched beside a wind-scoured boulder, searching for any sign of Tommy's passage, that patience was being tested by the urgent knowledge that hypothermia could kill a 12-year-old in hours. A distant sound cut through the howling wind, faint, almost human, but distorted by the storm. Marcus froze, straining to listen. There it was again, coming from somewhere above treeline, where the mountain's bare shoulders disappeared into grey clouds. He adjusted his pack and started climbing, using his grandfather's technique of reading terrain flow to predict where a frightened child might seek shelter. The old Cherokee methods his grandfather had taught him, tracking by intuition as much as sign, understanding how fear and exhaustion altered human behavior, felt like the only tools that mattered now. 20 minutes later, Marcus emerged above treeline into a landscape that belonged more to the Arctic than Colorado. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow horizontally across exposed rock faces and corniced ridges. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and he had to lean into the gale to keep from being knocked backward. But the sound was closer now, definitely human, definitely in distress. Marcus pulled out his emergency whistle and gave 3 sharp blasts, the rescue service's standard "Where are you?" signal. The response came immediately, 2 answering whistles from somewhere ahead and to his right, where a cluster of house-sized boulders offered the only visible shelter in the white wasteland. He fought through the storm, using his ice axe for stability as wind gusts threatened to tear him from the mountain. The sound of the whistles grew stronger, more desperate, and Marcus realized with growing alarm that he was hearing multiple voices, not just Tommy's cry for help. Behind the largest boulder, Marcus found them. Tommy Peterson huddled against the rock face with a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, both of them blue-lipped and shaking uncontrollably. The boy had wrapped his jacket around the smaller child, leaving himself exposed to the killing wind in a t-shirt that was already stiff with ice. "Are you Tommy?" Marcus shouted over the storm, already pulling emergency bivy sacks from his pack. The boy nodded, teeth chattering too violently for speech. Marcus wrapped both children in the reflective shelters, creating a small wind barrier against the boulder while his mind raced through the implications. 2 lost children changed everything: his rescue plan, his equipment calculations, his ability to move quickly through dangerous terrain. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked the girl gently, checking her fingers for signs of frostbite. "Emma," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've been lost for a long time." Emma. The name hit Marcus like a physical shock, memories of another Emma flooding back. Emma Hartwell, 8 years old, surrounded by wolves and somehow still alive. But that was impossible. Emma Hartwell was safe at home in Aspen, probably getting ready for some fancy party while he froze his ass off on a mountain. Except this girl had the same dark hair, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than an 8-year-old should, and she was wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked familiar, the same brand and style he'd seen on Emma Hartwell just days before. "Emma what?" Marcus asked, dreading the answer. "Hartwell," the girl replied, and Marcus's carefully constructed rescue plan collapsed like a house of cards. Emma Hartwell wasn't safe at home. She was here, on Blanca Peak, in the middle of a killer storm, miles from where she should have been. Which meant either this was an impossible coincidence or something was very wrong with the official story about her rescue and recovery. The wind gusted harder, driving ice crystals into Marcus's face like needles. Both children were showing advanced signs of hypothermia, slurred speech, loss of fine motor control, the dangerous drowsiness that preceded unconsciousness. He had maybe an hour to get them to shelter before their core temperatures dropped beyond the point of no return. But sheltering 2 hypothermic children on an exposed mountainside during a blizzard was a death sentence. His only option was to get them moving, to find the mining caves his grandfather had shown him years ago, somewhere in this white hell where 3 lives now hung in the balance. Marcus shouldered his pack and helped both children to their feet, his mind already calculating distances and survival odds. Whatever had brought Emma Hartwell back into his life would have to wait. Right now, the mountain was testing him in ways his grandfather had never prepared him for. The wind screamed across the exposed rock face as Marcus pulled both children closer to the boulder, his mind racing through impossible calculations. 2 hypothermic kids, deteriorating weather, and at least 3 miles to the nearest mining cave his grandfather had shown him years ago. The math was brutal: carrying capacity, caloric expenditure, time versus temperature drop. Every variable pointed toward failure. "Can you walk?" he asked Tommy, whose lips had gone from blue to an alarming grey-white. The boy nodded, but when Marcus helped him stand, Tommy's legs buckled immediately. 8 days of exposure and inadequate food had pushed him beyond the edge of physical collapse. Emma was in better condition somehow, but still dangerously hypothermic, her small frame shaking violently inside the emergency bivvy. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the social anxiety that made his throat close and his palms sweat even in sub-zero temperatures. This was beyond anything he'd trained for. 2 lives depending on decisions he wasn't qualified to make, in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced rescue professionals. "Trust your instincts," Jake's words echoed in his memory. But what instincts? The rational part of his brain screamed that he should hunker down, wait for backup, hope the storm passed before hypothermia claimed them all. The desperate part wanted to attempt a carry-out that would likely kill him and leave 2 children orphaned on a mountainside. "My grandfather told me about caves," Emma said suddenly, her voice small but surprisingly clear. "Old mines where people used to dig for silver." Marcus stared at her, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. "How could you possibly know about—" "He visits me sometimes," Emma continued matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "The old Cherokee man. He says the mountain remembers everything, even when people forget." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His grandfather had been dead for 3 years. There was no way this girl could know about him, about the mining claims he'd explored, about the Cherokee heritage. Marcus barely understood himself. Yet something in Emma's eyes, an ancient sadness that didn't belong in a child's face, made his skin crawl. "We need to move," Marcus said, pushing down the questions that threatened to paralyze him. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible coincidence had brought Emma Hartwell back into his life, survival took precedence over understanding. He rigged an improvised harness system using climbing rope, creating a way to help support Tommy's weight without completely carrying him. The boy was bigger than Emma but clearly weaker, his body shutting down after days of exposure. Emma, despite her hypothermia, seemed to possess an inner resilience that defied explanation. "There," Emma pointed through the swirling snow toward a ridge barely visible in the storm. "He says to follow the old elk trail toward the broken tooth." Marcus followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. The broken tooth was his grandfather's name for a distinctive rock formation that marked the approach to the hermit mine, a collapsed silver claim that offered the only substantial shelter for miles. But no one else had ever called it that. Joseph Clearwater's pet names for landmarks had died with him, except somehow they hadn't. "Stay between us," Marcus instructed Emma, positioning her in the middle as they began their desperate traverse. The wind tried to tear them from the mountain with each step, and the snow was accumulating so quickly that their tracks disappeared within minutes. Marcus found himself relying more on intuition than navigation, following subtle terrain features that his grandfather had taught him to read. Tommy stumbled constantly, his coordination failing as his core temperature dropped. Each fall cost precious time and energy, and Marcus could feel his own strength ebbing as he hauled the boy back to his feet again and again. The math was getting worse with every step. But Emma moved with a strange confidence, occasionally pointing toward route options that Marcus couldn't see until they were almost upon them. She seemed to know where the wind would be less severe, where the footing would be more secure, where they could rest for precious moments without losing too much body heat. "How?" Marcus gasped during one brief shelter behind a wind-sculpted cornice. "He taught you too," Emma replied, looking at him with those unsettling too-old eyes. "You just forgot how to listen." The rope connecting them felt like both salvation and condemnation, a lifeline that bound their fates together for better or worse. If one of them fell, they might all die. If Marcus made the wrong navigation choice, if Tommy's hypothermia progressed too far, if the storm intensified beyond their ability to travel, then Jake would be organizing a recovery mission instead of a rescue. But somewhere ahead, barely visible through the white chaos, Marcus caught a glimpse of darker stone, the entrance to the hermit mine. His grandfather's stories had been true. The mountain did remember everything. The question was whether they could reach that memory before the cold claimed them all. The mine entrance loomed out of the storm like a mouth carved into the mountain's face, dark timber supports framing an opening that disappeared into absolute blackness. Marcus had dreamed of this place for years after his grandfather's death, but seeing it now, real, solid salvation measured in feet rather than miles, nearly brought him to his knees. Tommy collapsed the moment they reached the entrance, his legs finally giving out completely. The boy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his skin waxy pale in the dim light filtering through the storm. Emma immediately knelt beside him, pulling off her own hat to cover his ears, and Marcus felt that familiar chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "He's not going to make it much longer," Emma said with the clinical detachment of someone far older than 8. "His body's shutting down." Marcus stared at her, his hands shaking as he pulled out his emergency gear. No child should be able to assess hypothermia with that kind of accuracy. No 8-year-old should sound like a field medic triaging casualties. But there was no time to process the impossibility of Emma Hartwell, not when Tommy's core temperature was dropping toward the point of no return. The mine shaft stretched back into the mountain further than his headlamp could penetrate, but the first chamber was large enough for shelter and protected from the killing wind. Marcus spread his emergency tarp on the rocky floor and helped Tommy onto it, already working through the hypothermia protocol his grandfather had drilled into him years ago. "We need skin-to-skin contact," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Shared body heat is the only thing that's going to bring his temperature up fast enough." Emma nodded and immediately began stripping off her outer layers, revealing the expensive base layers underneath that confirmed what Marcus already suspected. She wasn't just some random lost hiker. The gear was too sophisticated, too perfectly fitted, too expensive for a family camping trip gone wrong. But as she settled against Tommy's left side, something happened that made Marcus forget all about expensive equipment and impossible coincidences. Emma placed her small hands on Tommy's chest and began humming, a low, wordless melody that seemed to resonate through the stone around them. The sound was familiar, achingly so, though Marcus couldn't place where he'd heard it before. Tommy's breathing immediately began to slow and deepen. The blue tinge around his lips started to fade, replaced by the faintest hint of natural color. His shivering, which had been violent and uncontrolled, settled into regular tremors that suggested his body was beginning to generate heat again. "How are you doing that?" Marcus whispered, settling against Tommy's right side while his mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. "Same way you found us," Emma replied without stopping her humming. "Same way you knew which trail to follow when the tracks disappeared. Some things don't need explaining." The melody continued, and Marcus felt warmth spreading through his own body despite the sub-freezing air. But it wasn't just physical warmth. It was something deeper, older, like the feeling he'd experienced as a child when his grandfather told stories about the old ways, the sensation of being connected to something vast and ancient and completely beyond rational understanding. "This is impossible," his analytical mind insisted. Children didn't possess healing abilities. Hypothermia didn't reverse itself because of humming. 8-year-olds didn't navigate through blizzards or assess medical conditions with professional accuracy. But Tommy's color was definitely improving, his breathing becoming stronger and more regular with each passing minute. And somewhere in the back of Marcus's consciousness, he could swear he heard another voice joining Emma's melody, a deep, weathered baritone that sounded exactly like Joseph Clearwater singing the old Cherokee healing songs. The storm raged outside their stone shelter, wind howling through the mine entrance like the voices of the dead. But inside the ancient darkness, 3 children huddled together against the cold, and Marcus began to understand that everything he thought he knew about the world was about to change forever. "Emma," he said quietly, not wanting to break whatever spell was bringing Tommy back from the edge of death. "How long have you really been lost?" She looked at him with those impossibly old eyes, her humming never faltering. "Since before I was born," she replied, and Marcus felt the last of his rational worldview crumble into dust. Outside, the blizzard screamed its rage against the mountain. Inside, in the darkness where miners had once sought silver and found only stone, 3 lives hung suspended between worlds, and Marcus realized that some rescues required more than rope and training and emergency protocols. Some rescues required believing in things that shouldn't exist. The ordeal had only just begun. The warmth that had filled the mine chamber began to fade as dawn approached, and with it came the terrible reality of their situation. Tommy's breathing had stabilized through the night, but when Marcus checked their supplies by the grey light filtering through the entrance, his stomach dropped. 3 energy bars, half a bottle of water, and emergency bivvies designed for single-night exposure. Food for maybe 1 person for 2 days, stretched across 3 bodies that were burning calories just to stay alive. Marcus stepped outside to assess the storm and felt his last hope die. The blizzard had transformed the landscape into an alien moonscape, with drifts piled 12 feet high against the ridgelines. Every landmark he'd used to navigate was buried or obscured. Even if he could somehow carry both children, he had no idea which direction led to safety. His radio crackled with static when he tried to raise base camp. The storm was interfering with everything, turning his emergency beacon into an expensive paperweight. They were effectively cut off from the world, trapped in a stone tomb with supplies that wouldn't last until the weather cleared. When he returned to the mine, Emma was awake, those strange old eyes watching him with uncomfortable perception. "No one's coming," she said matter-of-factly. "Not until after the storm. The rescue team," Marcus began. "Will find our bodies," Emma interrupted, "unless—" She trailed off, staring into the deeper darkness of the mine shaft where his headlamp beam couldn't penetrate. Something in her expression made Marcus's skin crawl, a mix of fear and anticipation that belonged on no child's face. "Unless what?" "There are things in the deep places," Emma whispered. "Old things, hungry things. They've been waiting so long." Tommy stirred restlessly, mumbling in his sleep about sounds in the walls, about voices calling from the darkness beyond their small circle of light. Marcus told himself it was hypothermia-induced delirium, but the mine seemed to echo with more than just their breathing. Scratching sounds, like claws on stone. Whispers in a language that predated English but somehow felt familiar. By afternoon, Tommy was lucid but weak, and their water was nearly gone. Marcus faced an impossible choice: venture deeper into the mine system to search for water, leaving the children alone, or stay and watch them slowly dehydrate. Either option led to death, just by different paths. "I have to explore the tunnels," Marcus said, hating himself for the decision. "There might be water deeper in, or another way out." Emma grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't go alone. The darkness here, it remembers things that shouldn't be remembered." But Marcus had no choice. He left them with the last energy bar and his spare flashlight, then ventured into the mine's throat with growing dread. The tunnel sloped downward, branching into a maze of passages that spoke of desperate men chasing veins of silver into the mountain's heart. 20 feet in, his headlamp died. The backup light lasted another 30 seconds before flickering out, leaving him in absolute darkness that pressed against his eyes like a living thing. Marcus tried to retrace his steps, but the tunnels seemed to have shifted, walls appearing where none had been before. His rational mind insisted it was panic and disorientation, but his grandfather's voice whispered warnings about places where the earth grew thin and old hungers stirred. When he finally stumbled back to the main chamber hours later, empty-handed and half-mad with claustrophobia, he found Emma and Tommy huddled together in terror. Tommy was crying silently, pointing toward the mine's depths. "She went down there," he sobbed. "The other Emma. She said the first Emma wasn't real, wasn't supposed to be here. She said things about you, about your family." Marcus looked at Emma, his Emma, the one who'd guided them through the storm, and saw his own confusion reflected in her face. What other Emma? "The one who looks just like me," Emma whispered. "But wrong. She knows things about the night your family disappeared. She says your grandfather made promises he couldn't keep, and now the mountain wants payment." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop 10 degrees. From somewhere deep in the mine came a sound like children laughing, but distorted, multiplied, echoing off stone walls until it became something monstrous. Marcus felt his sanity fracturing as surely as hypothermia had nearly claimed Tommy. Whatever was happening here went beyond simple survival. They were caught between worlds, the rational world of rescue protocols and weather patterns, and something older and hungrier that lived in the spaces between stone and darkness. His supplies were gone, his navigation was compromised, and now the very reality he'd clung to was dissolving like snow in spring runoff. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain. Inside, in the darkness where desperate men had once sought fortune and found only emptiness, Marcus realized that some rescues demanded prices he'd never imagined paying. The mountain was collecting on a debt he'd never known existed, and Emma, whichever Emma was real, held the key to understanding what his grandfather had done 15 years ago to set this nightmare in motion. The laughter from the depths grew louder, and Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a locked door suddenly swinging open in his mind. The sound wasn't just echoing off mine walls, it was resonating through memories he'd buried so deep he'd convinced himself they were nightmares. "No," he whispered, backing against the stone wall. "That's impossible." But Emma, his Emma, was already standing, her small hand extended toward him with an expression of infinite sadness. "You remember now, don't you? The night they took your family. The night Grandfather Joseph tried to break the bargain." The memories crashed over Marcus like an avalanche. He was 7 years old again, hiding in the root cellar while his parents screamed upstairs. But they weren't screaming in fear. They were screaming in recognition. His mother's voice, high and desperate. "Joseph said you'd come back. He said you'd want the children, but we hoped." His father's deeper tones, pleading, "Take Marcus instead. He's the one with the gift. Leave the others alone." But they hadn't taken Marcus. They'd taken his sister Sarah, his little brother David, and his parents, leaving him alive and alone with nothing but fragments of terror and his grandfather's guilt-stricken silence. "The other Emma isn't real," Marcus said, his voice hollow as understanding flooded through him. "She's one of them. The mountain spirit's grandfather told stories about. The ones who steal children and leave. Echoes." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. He thought he could outsmart them, thought he could make a deal to protect his own family and then break it later. But the mountain doesn't forget debts, Marcus. And when Joseph died 3 years ago, the contract passed to you. The temperature plummeted further, and Marcus could see his breath misting in the sudden cold. From the mine's depths came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, some heavy like adults, some light like children, all moving with the wrong rhythm, the wrong cadence. "They've been calling the children to them ever since," Emma continued, her voice barely audible over the approaching sounds. Emma Hartwell was just the latest. Her parents didn't abandon her. She walked away from their campsite in the middle of the night, drawn by voices only she could hear. Just like Sarah and David walked away from their beds 15 years ago. Tommy whimpered, pointing toward the tunnel entrance where shadows were beginning to move independently of their light sources. The shadows had shapes, human-like but wrong, stretched and twisted like reflections in dark water. "But you're real," Marcus said desperately, grabbing Emma's shoulders. "You saved Tommy. You guided us here. You can't be—" "I'm real," Emma agreed, "but I'm not supposed to be. I broke free from them somehow, and now they're angry. They want me back, and they want you to honor your grandfather's debt. One way or another, the mountain gets its due." The other Emma emerged from the tunnel's mouth, identical to the girl beside Marcus except for her eyes, black pits that reflected no light, ancient and hungry and utterly without human warmth. Behind her came more shapes, adults and children, all wearing faces that might have once belonged to the living, but now served something else entirely. "Hello, Marcus," the shadow Emma said, her voice layered with harmonics that made his teeth ache. "Grandfather Joseph sends his regards from the deep places. He wants you to know he's sorry about the confusion, but a bargain is a bargain." Marcus felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, his Cherokee ancestors who'd known to appease the spirits of wild places, his grandfather who thought he could negotiate with forces beyond human understanding, and now himself caught between worlds with two children depending on his choices. "What do you want?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "What was promised," Shadow Emma replied. "The bloodline continuation. Joseph offered his descendants in exchange for protection during the mining years when the spirits were being driven from their homes. 3 generations of service in the spaces between worlds." The real Emma stepped closer to Marcus, her small hand finding his. "There's another way," she whispered, "but it means accepting what you are, what you've always been. The gift your parents saw, the connection that let you find us in the storm. You're not just Cherokee, you're a bridge between worlds." Marcus understood then why his social anxiety had always felt like drowning, why crowds and normal human interaction left him gasping for air. He'd been trying to live in only one world when his spirit belonged to the spaces between them. The shadows pressed closer, and Tommy's frightened sobbing echoed off the stone walls. Outside, the storm howled with renewed fury, but Marcus realized it wasn't just weather anymore, it was the mountain itself, demanding resolution to a debt that had poisoned 3 generations. Everything he'd believed about his family's disappearance, about his grandfather's stories, about the nature of reality itself, lay in ruins around him. The rescue mission had become something else entirely, a reckoning with the truth of what he was and what he was meant to become. Marcus closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of revelation settle into his bones like sediment in still water. The truth had shattered everything he thought he knew, but in the wreckage, something else was taking shape, not despair, but a strange, fierce clarity. When he opened his eyes, the shadows had drawn closer, their hunger palpable in the frigid air. But Marcus no longer felt the paralyzing fear that had defined so much of his life. The anxiety that had always made him feel like he was drowning suddenly made sense. He'd been fighting against his own nature, trying to breathe air when his spirit needed something deeper. 3 generations, he said quietly, his voice carrying a new authority that surprised him. "But you're forgetting something important about Cherokee tradition." The shadow Emma tilted her head, those black pit eyes narrowing. "Joseph's debt." "Grandfather made his bargain out of desperation, not wisdom," Marcus interrupted, stepping protectively in front of both children. "He was afraid for his family, for his people. But fear makes poor contracts, and the spirits know this." His Emma, squeezed his hand, and he felt warmth flow between them. Not just physical, but something deeper. Understanding. Recognition. The same connection that had let him find her in the impossible storm, that had guided him through whiteout conditions when his instruments failed. "You felt it too," Marcus said to her. "When you broke free from them. The wrongness of it. Children aren't meant to serve in the spaces between worlds. We're meant to bridge them." Tommy looked up at him with tear-stained cheeks, and Marcus saw something he'd missed before, the same gift that Emma possessed, that Marcus himself carried. The boy's eyes held depths that spoke of seeing more than the physical world allowed. 3 gifts, Marcus realized aloud, pieces clicking together like a puzzle solving itself. That's why the storm brought us together, not to fulfill some corrupt bargain, but to create something new. The shadows hissed, pressing closer, but Marcus felt his grandfather's presence differently now, not guilt-ridden and desperate, but proud, approving. Joseph Clearwater had made a mistake, yes, but he'd also ensured his grandson would be strong enough to correct it when the time came. "The mining operation your people protected," Marcus said to the shadow Emma, his voice growing stronger. "It wasn't just about silver. They were disturbing something sacred, weren't they? A place where the world grows thin, where spirits could move between realms. The temperature around them fluctuated wildly, as the shadows writhed with agitation. Marcus felt the truth of it in his bones. His grandfather had been trying to protect both worlds, human and spirit, during a time when industry threatened to tear holes in reality itself. The bargain was never about servitude, Marcus continued, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after endless night. It was about guardianship. But somewhere in the translation, in the fear and desperation, it became twisted into something else. Emma stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite her small size. "We choose to be guardians," she said. "Not slaves, not sacrifices. Guardians of the places where worlds touch, where lost children can find their way home." Tommy nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve but standing straighter. "I can feel them," he whispered. "The real spirits. They're tired of being hungry all the time. They want to remember what it was like before the mines, before the fear." Marcus felt power building around them. Not the dark, hungry power of the shadows, but something warm and ancient and incredibly strong. The mine shaft began to glow with soft light that had nothing to do with their failed equipment, light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. The shadow Emma snarled, her form wavering like heat distortion. "Joseph's blood belongs to us. The contract is fulfilled," Marcus said firmly. 3 generations of guardians, freely chosen, will protect the sacred places, but as living bridges, not as prisoners in the dark. He reached out with senses he'd spent 17 years trying to ignore, feeling the mountain's true spirit beneath layers of corruption and hunger. Ancient grief, yes, and anger at the destruction humans had brought, but also hope buried deep, waiting for someone to remember the old ways of balance and respect. The shadows began to dissolve, their artificial hunger fading as the mountain's true voice rose to replace them. Marcus heard his family's voices in that sound, not trapped or tortured, but free, finally free to move on to whatever came after. "We have work to do," Marcus said, looking at Emma and Tommy with new purpose burning in his chest. "The storm is breaking and people will be looking for us. But this is just the beginning." Emma smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her, she looked like the 8-year-old child she was supposed to be. "The mountain remembers how to heal now," she said, "and so do we." Outside, the first rays of dawn pierced the retreating clouds, and Marcus felt his grandfather's debt finally, truly paid. The light filling the mine shaft wasn't harsh like artificial illumination, but gentle as filtered sunlight through autumn leaves. Marcus felt the mountain's presence differently now, not as a looming threat, but as something vast and patient that had been waiting for understanding rather than fear. But as the shadows dissolved and the corrupted spirits faded, he knew their real challenges were only beginning. "We need to get moving," Marcus said, shouldering his pack with movements that felt more certain than they had in days. The crippling social anxiety that had defined his 17 years hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something manageable, a sensitivity to the spaces between worlds rather than a weakness to overcome. "The storm's breaking, but people will be looking for us. Emma's adoptive parents will have questions we're not ready to answer." Emma wiped dust from her jacket, her movements quick and efficient, the otherworldly weight that had clung to her since he'd found her trapped under the fallen timber was gone, replaced by the natural energy of a child who'd been through hell and survived. "They'll try to take me back," she said matter-of-factly. "The Hartwells. They think I'm just damaged goods now, evidence of their failed scheme." Tommy struggled to his feet, still weak but determined. The hypothermia had passed, but Marcus could see the deeper change in the boy's eyes, the same awakening he'd experienced himself. The gift that ran in bloodlines touched by the sacred places, dormant until crisis forced it to surface. "Let them try," Marcus said, checking their remaining supplies. His grandfather's emergency cash had sustained them through the worst of it, but they'd need real food and medical attention soon. "They don't understand what you really are. What any of us are." The truth of their situation settled over him like accepting a heavy but necessary burden. The Hartwells weren't just neglectful adoptive parents. They were part of something larger and more dangerous. Emma's inheritance, the convenient hiking accident, the precise location where she'd been abandoned. It all pointed to people with resources and connections who wouldn't simply give up when their plan failed. "We stick together," Marcus continued, leading them toward the mine entrance where genuine daylight was beginning to penetrate. "Whatever comes next, we face it as guardians. No more isolation, no more pretending we're normal kids who just happened to find lost children in impossible storms." Emma nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "There are others like us," she said quietly. "I felt them while I was connected to the shadows. Other children with the gift, scattered across different states. Some of them are in danger." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. If the Hartwells represented one attempt to exploit children with supernatural abilities, there would be others. Wealthy families, government agencies, corporations. Anyone who discovered the truth about the spaces between worlds and decided to profit from it. "One crisis at a time," Marcus said, though he felt the weight of future responsibilities settling across his shoulders. His grandfather had carried similar burdens alone, trying to protect the sacred places with incomplete understanding and growing desperation. Marcus wouldn't make the same mistakes, but he also wouldn't abandon the work that needed doing. They emerged from the mine into crisp morning air that tasted of snow and pine and possibilities. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape transformed. Trees heavy with fresh powder, the world clean and bright under clearing skies. In the distance, Marcus could already hear the rhythmic beating of helicopter rotors. "Search and rescue," he said, pointing toward the approaching aircraft. "Probably been looking for us since the storm cleared enough for flight." Tommy grabbed his arm, suddenly anxious. "What do we tell them? About what happened in there? About the shadows and the voices and—" "We tell them what they need to hear," Marcus said firmly. "We got trapped by the storm, took shelter in an abandoned mine, survived on emergency supplies until rescue arrived. Everything else stays between us until we understand it better." The helicopter circled overhead, and Marcus felt his anxiety spike. Not the overwhelming panic he'd experienced before, but a manageable awareness of scrutiny and complicated social dynamics ahead. The pilot would have questions, the rescue coordinator would want detailed reports, and eventually they'd face Emma's adoptive parents and whatever legal machinery they'd set in motion. But beneath the anxiety, Marcus felt something new and unshakable: purpose. The scared, isolated teenager who'd begun this rescue mission was gone, replaced by someone who understood his place in a larger story. He was Cherokee, mountain-born, bridge between worlds, and he had work to do. The helicopter began its descent toward a clearing 50 yards away, rotor wash sending snow spiraling through the morning air. Marcus looked at Emma and Tommy, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. They'd found each other in the storm, forged bonds that went deeper than simple survival. Whatever came next, legal battles, dangerous enemies, other children who needed protection, they wouldn't face it alone. The mountain had taught them that isolation was just another kind of prison, and they'd chosen freedom instead. The real journey was just beginning. The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of snow and noise, but Marcus felt his awareness extend beyond the mechanical chaos to something deeper. The mountains pulse beneath his feet, Emma's steady breathing beside him, Tommy's frightened but determined heartbeat. The gifts that had awakened in the mine weren't fading with daylight. If anything, they grew stronger as he learned to trust them. Two figures emerged from the aircraft, a paramedic in orange gear and a man Marcus recognized as Sheriff Davidson, whose weathered face bore the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 days coordinating an impossible search. Behind them came a third person that made Marcus's blood freeze: Dr. Elena Hartwell, Emma's adoptive mother, her expensive winter clothing pristine despite the wilderness setting. "She found us," Emma whispered, her small hand finding Marcus's. Faster than should have been possible. Marcus felt the truth of it through their connection. Dr. Hartwell wasn't here by coincidence. She had resources, technology, maybe even inside information about search and rescue operations. The woman approaching them wasn't a relieved parent. She was a predator who'd discovered her prey had survived. "Remember the story," Marcus murmured to both children. "Storm, shelter, survival, nothing else." Sheriff Davidson reached them first, his relief genuine but shadowed by professional suspicion. "Marcus Clearwater, we've been looking for you since Tuesday night. Your supervisor said you were attempting a solo extraction, highly irregular for someone your age." "The storm came in faster than predicted," Marcus replied, falling back on the calm authority he'd discovered in the mine. "Radio went dead, GPS failed. We found shelter and waited it out." He gestured toward the mine entrance. "Emergency cache inside kept us alive." The paramedic knelt beside Tommy, checking vitals with efficient movements. "This boy needs immediate medical attention. Hypothermia, dehydration, possible frostbite on his extremities." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward, her smile as cold as the morning air. "Emma, sweetheart, we were so worried." Her voice carried professional warmth, but Marcus felt the wrongness radiating from her like heat from a fever. "Come here, to Mama." Emma pressed closer to Marcus instead. "I want to stay with Marcus and Tommy." "Don't be silly, dear. You're traumatized. You need proper medical care, not wilderness adventures with teenage boys." Dr. Hartwell's tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Sheriff Davidson, I'll need to take custody of my daughter immediately." Marcus felt the mountain's attention focus on them like sunlight through a magnifying glass. The sacred places weren't done with Dr. Hartwell. Her presence here was an intrusion that disturbed the newly restored balance. But he also sensed something else. Other watchers, human ones, positioned beyond the tree line with equipment that had nothing to do with search and rescue. "Actually," Sheriff Davidson said slowly, "there are procedures for this kind of situation. 3 children surviving alone in extreme conditions. We need statements, medical evaluations, a full investigation into how an 8-year-old girl ended up separated from her family in the first place." Dr. Hartwell's composure cracked slightly. "I've already provided detailed statements about Emma's disappearance. She has a history of sleepwalking, wandering off. We've been working with specialists." "Sleepwalking?" Marcus interrupted, letting a hint of his newfound power color his voice. "Emma never mentioned sleepwalking during our 3 days together. In fact, she showed remarkable survival skills for someone with that kind of disorder." Tommy looked up from the paramedic's examination, his young voice carrying unexpected strength. "Emma saved us. She knew which way to go when the compass stopped working." Marcus felt Dr. Hartwell's attention shift to Tommy like a searchlight, and beneath her clinical interest, he sensed something hungry and calculating. The woman wasn't just after Emma. She was evaluating Tommy for whatever sick purpose had brought her to the mountains. "Children often exhibit unusual behaviors under extreme stress," Dr. Hartwell said smoothly. "Survival situations can trigger temporary abilities that fade once proper care is restored." The wrongness of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. Dr. Hartwell knew about the gifts, not just knew, she understood them well enough to predict how they manifested under stress. This wasn't about inheritance, money, or family dynamics. This was about harvesting children with supernatural abilities. "We should get everyone back to town," the paramedic said, standing and shouldering his kit. "These kids need warmth, food, and proper medical evaluation before anyone makes custody decisions." Marcus felt the moment crystallizing around them. The choice between safety and truth, between protecting their secret and protecting themselves. Through his expanded awareness, he sensed the watchers in the trees shifting position, moving to intercept if the children were separated from Dr. Hartwell's control. Emma looked up at him with 8-year-old eyes that held ancient wisdom. "It's time," she whispered. "Everything we learned in the mountain, everything Grandfather Joseph taught you, this is what it was all for." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of 3 generations settling into his bones like strength. The final test wasn't surviving the storm or facing the shadows in the mine. It was this moment, standing in morning sunlight with helicopters and lies and hidden enemies, choosing to use everything he'd learned to protect the innocent. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus felt the mountain's power flow through him like electricity through copper wire, every nerve ending suddenly alive with information. Dr. Hartwell's pulse quickened as she reached for Emma, her movements too practiced, too confident. The watchers in the trees, 5 of them Marcus could sense now, carried weapons that gleamed with more than morning sunlight. "Emma stays with me," Marcus said, his voice carrying an authority that made Sheriff Davidson's hand instinctively move toward his radio. Dr. Hartwell's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no legal authority here, boy. Emma is my daughter, and she's coming home." Her eyes flicked toward the tree line, a signal. The first shot came from Marcus's left, a tranquilizer dart that would have dropped him instantly if his enhanced awareness hadn't screamed the warning a heartbeat before impact. He twisted aside, the dart catching his jacket sleeve instead of flesh, and felt the mountain's rage surge through him like wildfire. "GET down!" Sheriff Davidson shouted, drawing his sidearm as more darts whistled through the clearing. The paramedic dove behind the helicopter, cursing in rapid Spanish. But Marcus was already moving, his grandfather's training and his own awakened gifts merging into something fluid and deadly. Emma pressed against his back as he guided her toward the mine entrance, Tommy stumbling alongside them. Dr. Hartwell barked orders in a language that sounded like corrupted Cherokee, old words twisted into something sharp and commanding. The watchers emerged from the trees in tactical formation, their gear military grade, but their movements wrong somehow, too synchronized, like puppets dancing to the same strings. Marcus felt the corruption radiating from them, human shells guided by something that remembered hunger and shadows. The mining company, Marcus realized aloud as they reached the mine entrance. They didn't just disturb sacred ground, they made a deal with what lived there before your grandfather bound it. Emma nodded grimly. "Dr. Hartwell isn't just my adoptive mother. She's been collecting children like us for years, feeding our abilities to something that should have stayed buried." Sheriff Davidson's service weapon barked twice, dropping one of the advancing figures, but the others kept coming without even acknowledging their fallen companion. The paramedic screamed as clawed hands that had been human moments before dragged him from behind the helicopter. Marcus felt his social anxiety transform into something primal and protective. These weren't people anymore. They were violations of the natural order, and everything his Cherokee blood knew about balance and sacred spaces demanded their destruction. "Tommy, can you reach the spirits we freed in the mine?" Marcus called over the sound of gunfire and inhuman shrieking. The boy's eyes went wide with understanding, then fierce with concentration. "They're coming," he whispered. "The real guardians. They've been waiting so long to protect something instead of just being hungry." The air around the mine entrance shimmered like heat distortion, and suddenly the corrupted figures advancing on them stopped mid-stride. Their synchronized movements became jerky, uncertain, as if competing signals fought for control of their borrowed flesh. Dr. Hartwell raised her hands, speaking in that twisted Cherokee dialect, but Emma stepped forward with 8-year-old defiance blazing in her eyes. "I know that language," Emma said, her small voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "I learned it while I was connected to the shadows, but you're pronouncing it wrong." She spoke 3 words in pure Cherokee, syllables that rang like struck bells, and Dr. Hartwell's control shattered visibly. The woman staggered backward, blood trickling from her nose, while her puppet soldiers collapsed like marionettes with severed strings. But the mountain wasn't finished. Marcus felt the earth beneath their feet responding to decades of suppressed rage, and cracks began spider-webbing across the clearing. The helicopter's rotors screamed as metal twisted, and somewhere in the distance, other aircraft were approaching. Real rescue teams this time, drawn by the sheriff's distress calls. "It's over," Marcus said, walking toward Dr. Hartwell with quiet certainty. The woman who'd orchestrated Emma's abandonment, who'd built a career harvesting gifted children for some ancient hunger, now cowered before a 17-year-old Cherokee boy who'd finally learned to stop running from his heritage. "You don't understand," Dr. Hartwell gasped, her professional composure completely shattered. "The things we've learned, The applications for national security, for medical research, these children's abilities could revolutionize. These children, Marcus interrupted, are not your resources to harvest. Emma walked up beside him, taking his hand with the simple trust that had carried them through 3 days of impossible survival. Tommy joined them, no longer the frightened lost boy Marcus had found, but someone who understood his place in a larger pattern of protection and purpose. Above them, the mountain spirits his grandfather had tried so desperately to appease finally found their peace. The sacred places were protected again, but this time by living guardians who understood that some gifts were meant for healing, not hunger. Sheriff Davidson surveyed the wreckage of Dr. Hartwell's operation with shell-shocked eyes, but Marcus knew the official reports would never capture what had really happened here. Some truths were too large for paperwork. The real work, protecting others like them, learning to use their gifts responsibly, honoring the spaces between worlds, was just beginning. Marcus felt the weight of victory settling over the clearing like fresh snow, beautiful, transformative, and somehow heavier than he'd expected. Dr. Hartwell sat zip-tied against a pine tree, her sophisticated facade completely shattered, while Sheriff Davidson coordinated with the incoming federal agents who'd been tracking her operation for months. The corrupted soldiers lay motionless in the snow, their borrowed flesh finally at peace. But Emma's hand in his trembled, and through their connection, Marcus felt the shadow of terrible knowledge. "There are others," she whispered, her 8-year-old voice carrying the burden of things no child should understand. "I saw them while I was connected to the shadows. 27 children, maybe more, scattered across facilities in 6 states. They're trapped, Marcus, being used like batteries." The magnitude of it hit him like a physical blow. Rescuing Emma and stopping Dr. Hartwell wasn't an ending, it was barely the beginning. Somewhere out there, other children with gifts like theirs were suffering in laboratories and research facilities, their abilities harvested by people who saw them as resources rather than human beings. Tommy joined them, his young face grave with new understanding. "The Spirit showed me things while you were fighting, networks, connections, families who've been selling their gifted children for decades. It's not just random, it's organized, systematic." Marcus felt his grandfather's presence one final time, a whisper of approval and warning carried on the mountain wind. "The price of becoming a true guardian, grandson, is giving up the luxury of childhood. You've awakened something that can't be put back to sleep." "We have to help them," Marcus said, though even speaking the words felt like signing away any chance of a normal teenage existence. No college applications, no worrying about social anxiety or first dates or any of the ordinary struggles that had defined his life just days ago. "We're the only ones who understand what those children are experiencing." Emma nodded solemnly. "Dr. Hartwell's files are in her helicopter. Digital records of everything, locations, contacts, financial networks. But accessing them means exposing ourselves to federal authorities, becoming part of official investigations." The sacrifice crystallized in Marcus's mind with painful clarity. To save the other children, they'd have to surrender their anonymity, their privacy, their chance to simply disappear back into normal lives. They'd become government assets themselves, protected perhaps, but never truly free. Sheriff Davidson approached, his weathered face reflecting the strain of processing impossible events. "Son, there are people on those incoming helicopters who want to debrief you extensively. They're calling this a matter of national security, asking questions I don't have answers for." Marcus felt the choice point stretching before them like a chasm. They could lie, minimize their abilities, try to fade back into obscurity while other children suffered, or they could step fully into the light, accepting whatever consequences came with revealing the truth about the spaces between worlds. "The children in those facilities," Marcus said quietly, "they're dying, aren't they? Being slowly drained until there's nothing left." Emma's nod was barely visible. "Some of them called out while I was connected. Their voices are getting weaker." Tommy wiped his nose with his sleeve, trying to hide tears. "I don't want to be a test subject, But I also can't pretend I didn't see them. Can't just go back to school and act like none of this happened. Marcus thought of his grandfather, carrying the burden of protecting sacred places alone, slowly consumed by isolation and incomplete knowledge. Joseph Clearwater had tried to bridge two worlds without understanding either fully, and it had cost him everything: his health, his family relationships, ultimately his life. But they didn't have to make the same mistakes. They had each other, and more importantly, they had proof that the system could be fought and won against. We'd tell them everything, Marcus decided, feeling pieces of his old life falling away like autumn leaves. We become witnesses, evidence, whatever they need us to be, but we do it together, and we do it with conditions. The approaching helicopters grew louder, military precision evident in their formation. Within minutes, this clearing would be swarming with federal agents, scientists, officials who'd want to study and classify and control everything they'd experienced. Emma squeezed his hand. Once we start talking, there's no going back. We'll never be normal kids again. We were never normal kids, Tommy said with surprising wisdom. We just didn't know it yet. Marcus looked at his two companions, a traumatized 8-year-old who could speak to shadows, a lost boy who could commune with mountain spirits, and himself, a Cherokee teenager who'd finally stopped running from his heritage. Together they'd survived impossible odds, faced ancient horrors, and emerged as something new. The helicopters touched down in coordinated precision, disgorging teams of agents in dark suits who moved with purpose across the snow-covered clearing. Marcus felt his anxiety spike one final time, then settle into something manageable and familiar, not the paralyzing social fear he'd carried for years, but the natural wariness of someone who understood the weight of responsibility. They walked forward together to meet whatever came next. 3 children who'd chosen to sacrifice their innocence to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The real work was just beginning. Agent Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead helicopter with the kind of careful authority that suggested she'd dealt with unusual situations before. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her eyes swept the clearing with professional assessment. Taking in the zip-tied Dr. Hartwell, the motionless figures scattered across the snow, and the 3 children standing together like they were facing a firing squad. "Sheriff Davidson," she called, producing credentials that caught the morning light. "Agent Chen, FBI Paranormal Investigations Unit. We've been tracking Dr. Hartwell's operation for 8 months. Marcus felt Emma's hand tighten in his Paranormal Investigations Unit. So the government already knew about people like them, had been studying and categorizing supernatural abilities while children disappeared into research facilities. The weight of that knowledge settled into his chest like cold stone. "The children have been through significant trauma," Sheriff Davidson said, stepping slightly forward in an unconsciously protective gesture. "Whatever debriefing you need should probably wait until—" "Actually," Marcus interrupted, his voice steadier than he felt, "we want to talk now, while everything's fresh, while we can still remember exactly what happened." Agent Chen studied him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to catalogue details most adults missed: the way he held himself, the careful placement of his feet, the protective positioning around Emma and Tommy. "You're Marcus Clearwater, 17 Cherokee Heritage First-Year Wilderness Guide. You've been missing for 4 days." "We weren't missing," Tommy said quietly. "We were exactly where we needed to be." Something shifted in Agent Chen's expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition. She gestured to her team, and they began setting up what looked like a mobile command center, complete with recording equipment and communication arrays. "Dr. Hartwell's helicopter contains digital files," Emma said, her 8-year-old voice cutting through the adult preparations with startling clarity. "Locations of other facilities, financial records, contact networks. Children are being held in at least 6 states, and their conditions are deteriorating." Agent Chen's professional composure cracked slightly. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I was connected to them," Emma replied with the matter-of-fact tone children used when explaining obvious things to confused adults. Through the shadows in the mine, through the network Dr. Hartwell built. They're calling for help, but their voices are getting weaker. Marcus watched Agent Chen process this information, seeing the exact moment when theoretical knowledge collided with practical reality. The FBI might have files on paranormal investigations, but actually standing in front of gifted children was clearly different from reading reports. "We have conditions," Marcus said, stepping into the awkward silence. "If we're going to cooperate with your investigation, if we're going to help you save the other children, we need guarantees." "You're minors," Agent Chen said automatically. "You don't really have the authority to negotiate." "We have information you need," Tommy interrupted, and Marcus felt proud of the boy's newfound confidence. "We understand how the abilities work, how the network functions. Without us, you're just collecting evidence on crimes you can't fully comprehend." Agent Chen looked between the three of them, and Marcus could see her recalibrating her approach. Whatever she'd expected to find in this mountain clearing, it wasn't three traumatized children who spoke with the authority of people who'd stared into ancient darkness and survived. "What kind of conditions?" she asked finally. "We stay together," Marcus said immediately. "No separating us for individual questioning or evaluation. We've been through this as a team, and that's how we're going to process it." "Medical care that respects our privacy," Emma added. "No experimental procedures, no testing our abilities for research purposes. Treatment for trauma and physical injury only." "And access to the files," Tommy finished. "We want to see everything you know about other facilities, other children. If we're helping you plan rescues, we need complete information." Marcus felt his grandfather's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder, approval and pride from beyond the veil between worlds. This was what Joseph Clearwater had tried to teach him, not to hide from responsibility, but to approach it with wisdom and clear boundaries. Agent Chen exchanged glances with her team, quick conversations conducted in low voices and subtle gestures. Finally, she turned back to them with something that might have been respect. "I can guarantee the first two conditions immediately," she said. "The third will require authorization from my supervisors, but given what you've accomplished here," she gestured at the clearing where Dr. Hartwell's operation lay in ruins, "I think we can make arrangements." Emma squeezed Marcus's hand, and through their connection he felt her relief mixed with determination. They'd chosen the harder path, cooperation instead of concealment, responsibility instead of safety, but at least they'd chosen it together. The morning sun climbed higher above the Sangre de Cristo peaks, warming the snow and making the world look almost normal. But Marcus knew they'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed, accepted a burden that would reshape everything that came after. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time since finding Emma pinned beneath that fallen timber, Marcus felt ready for whatever came next. The return. 3 weeks after the mountain, Marcus stood in the familiar doorway of his aunt's house in Taos, but nothing felt the same. The worn wooden frame, the faded paint on the porch rails, even the smell of sage and coffee drifting from the kitchen, it was all exactly as he'd left it, but he felt like an archaeologist examining artifacts from someone else's life. "You look different," Aunt Rosa said, studying his face with the careful attention she usually reserved for her weaving patterns. "Older. Not just tired, older." Marcus set his duffel bag down, noting absently how his movements had changed. No wasted motion, constant awareness of exits and potential threats, shoulders squared in a way that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with carrying invisible weight. The social anxiety that had defined him for years still whispered at the edges of his mind, but it felt manageable now. Perspective, maybe, or just understanding that some fears were worth facing. "A lot happened up there," he said, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate. Rosa pulled him into a fierce hug, and for a moment Marcus let himself be 17 again, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo and feeling the safety of unconditional family love. But even as he relaxed into her embrace, part of his awareness remained alert, cataloguing the sounds from the street, the patterns of light and shadow across the living room floor. The FBI woman called, Rosa said, stepping back but keeping her hands on his shoulders. Agent Chen. She said you'd been very helpful with their investigation, that charges are being filed across multiple states. Her dark eyes searched his face. She also said you've agreed to continue consulting with them on related cases. Marcus nodded, thinking of Emma and Tommy in the secure facility outside Denver where they were being debriefed and treated for trauma. Not a prison. Agent Chen had kept her word about that, but not freedom either. Emma's adoptive parents were facing federal charges for conspiracy and child endangerment, while social services worked to place her with relatives who might actually want her for herself, rather than her trust fund. Tommy's situation was more complicated. His parents had been killed in a car accident 2 years ago, the same accident that had awakened his ability to communicate with spirits. 12 children recovered so far, Marcus said quietly, from facilities in Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and New Mexico. 2 more locations identified in Texas and Arizona. Emma was right. It was bigger than we thought. Rosa led him to the kitchen table, automatically setting out food even though it was mid-afternoon. Leftover enchiladas, fresh fruit, the kind of nurturing sustenance that had grounded him his entire life. But as he ate, Marcus found himself thinking about field rations and emergency protocols, about how to purify water in winter conditions, and which mountain plants could provide calories during extended survival situations. Your grandfather would be proud, Rosa said suddenly. Marcus looked up, surprised by the observation. Why? Joseph spent his whole life trying to protect the sacred places alone. You found a way to do it with help, with connection to something larger than yourself. She paused, studying his face with that uncanny intuition she'd always possessed. But you also look like someone carrying a burden he never meant to pick up. The truth of that settled into Marcus's chest like recognition. He thought of the files Agent Chen had shown them. Hundreds of missing persons reports spanning decades, all children with unusual gifts. All disappeared into networks of research facilities and private collectors. The scope of it was staggering, and knowing about it meant accepting responsibility for helping to fix it. There's a girl in Phoenix, Marcus said quietly. 11 years old, disappeared 3 months ago. Her medical records show experimental treatment for behavioral anomalies, but her school reports mention incidents with electronics malfunctioning around her. Emma thinks she's still alive, still calling out through whatever connection these abilities create. Rosa reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. And you're going to help find her. Next week. Agent Chen's team has legal authorization to investigate the facility, but they need someone who understands what they're looking for, what questions to ask. Marcus met his aunt's eyes. I can't go back to school and pretend none of this happened. Too many children are still out there. What about college? Your future plans? Marcus smiled, and he could hear how it sounded different now. Not the anxious, people-pleasing expression of someone trying to avoid conflict, but something quieter and more certain. Agent Chen mentioned programs for people with specialized knowledge of paranormal investigations, accelerated degrees, fieldwork that actually matters. It's not the future I planned, but it's the one I choose. Through the kitchen window, the Sangre de Cristo peaks rose against the afternoon sky, snow-capped and eternal. Marcus felt the mountain spirit's presence like a distant echo, approval and blessing carried on desert wind. He was home, but he was also different, shaped by responsibility he'd never expected, connected to purposes larger than his individual anxiety and dreams. The real work continued tomorrow. The digital clock on Rosa's kitchen counter read 6:47 a.m. when Marcus's phone buzzed with the familiar ringtone he'd assigned to Agent Chen. 6 months since the mountain, and early morning calls had become part of his new routine. Updates on rescued children, requests for consultation on unusual cases, sometimes just check-ins to make sure he was managing the psychological weight of his expanded world. This call was different. Marcus, we found her. Agent Chen's voice carried exhaustion but also satisfaction. Lily Martinez, the girl in Phoenix. She's safe, and she's asking for you and Emma. Marcus felt the familiar surge of relief and purpose that came with successful rescues. 13 children now, pulled from facilities across the Southwest, all of them alive because Emma's connection through the shadow network had guided them to the right locations. Each rescue validated the choice they'd made in that snowy clearing: cooperation over concealment, shared burden over individual safety. "How is she?" Marcus asked, already reaching for the go-bag he kept packed beside his desk. "Physically healthy, considering. Psychologically, well, you know better than most what these children go through. She's been asking about the boy who talks to mountains ever since we pulled her out. Emma's gift for communication seems to have spread information about our team through whatever channels these abilities create." Marcus smiled at that. Emma was 15 now, officially in federal protective custody, but practically serving as the FBI's youngest consultant on paranormal child trafficking cases. Her ability to maintain contact with other gifted children had become the key to their entire operation, though the responsibility sometimes left her withdrawn and tired in ways that worried everyone who cared about her. "I can be in Phoenix by noon," Marcus said, already calculating travel time and wondering if Tommy could join them. The younger boy, now 13 and living with a Cherokee family in Oklahoma, had developed into their team's spiritual anchor, helping rescued children understand their abilities as gifts rather than curses, teaching them grounding techniques their grandfather would have recognized. "Actually," Agent Chen said, and something in her tone made Marcus pause in his packing, "there's something else. Something I think you should hear in person. Can you stop in Denver first? There's been a development in Emma's case. Good news, but complicated." 2 hours later, Marcus sat across from Emma in the secure conference room they'd come to think of as their unofficial headquarters. She'd grown taller in the past months, but more than that, she'd grown into her power with a confidence that reminded him of traditional healers he'd met on the reservation. Her ability to communicate through the shadow network had become precisely calibrated, no longer the raw, overwhelming connection that had nearly destroyed her in the mine. "They found my sister," Emma said without preamble, her voice carrying carefully controlled emotion. "My biological sister. Dr. Hartwell's files included genetic records. Apparently she was searching for families with hereditary abilities, and my birth parents had 2 daughters before they were killed in what we now know wasn't an accident." Marcus felt his chest tighten with recognition. "Where is she?" "Living with a family in Montana. Adopted after our parents died, completely unaware of her heritage or abilities." Emma's hands moved restlessly across the table surface. "Her name is Grace. She's 12, and according to her school records, she's been having behavioral difficulties and attention issues that sound exactly like untrained psychic abilities." "You want to contact her," Marcus said, understanding immediately. Emma nodded. "Not just contact, protect. If Dr. Hartwell had records about her, others might too. And Grace doesn't know what she is, doesn't know how to defend herself or recognize danger." Through the conference room window, Marcus could see mountains rising in the distance, not his beloved Sangre de Cristos, but the same eternal presence that had grounded him throughout this strange new life. He thought of his grandfather, isolated and struggling alone, and then of their small team that had grown into something like a family, bound together by shared purpose and mutual protection. "Agent Chen cleared me for Montana," Emma continued. "But she wants you there too. Says your experience with Cherokee's spiritual traditions might help Grace understand what's happening to her." Marcus thought of Lily Martinez waiting in Phoenix, of the files on Agent Chen's desk containing dozens more missing children, of the endless work that stretched before them like a mountain range with no visible peaks. 6 months ago, the scope of responsibility would have triggered his anxiety into paralysis. Now it felt like coming home to himself. "When do we leave?" he asked. Emma's smile transformed her face, erasing the careful professional composure she'd developed and revealing the sister she was ready to become. "Tomorrow morning. Tommy's flying in tonight. Apparently Grace's abilities include some connection to earth spirits, so we figured A full team approach would be best. Marcus reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand, feeling through their connection the mix of hope and terror that came with expanding family. They were no longer the traumatized children who'd stumbled into federal custody. They were something new, something unprecedented. A chosen family of young people who'd found their purpose in protecting others like themselves. Outside, the Denver mountains caught the afternoon sun, and Marcus felt his grandfather's presence one more time, warm with approval and blessing. Joseph Clearwater had died trying to bridge two worlds alone. His grandson had learned to build bridges that others could cross safely. The real work continued, but they continued it together.